It is the early hours of June 5, 1944, and in a requisitioned country house near Portsmouth, a lieutenant colonel is standing over a table the size of a tennis court. On it lies a map unlike anything most of the men in the room have ever seen. Every hedgerow, every drainage ditch, every farmhouse along a 5-mile stretch of Normandy coastline has been rendered in obsessive detail, right down to the gradient of the beach at low tide and the likely bearing weight of the sand beneath a Sherman tank's tracks. Officers lean over it with pencils and slide rules, checking timings against a chart of moon phases and tidal predictions calculated to the minute. None of this exists by accident. Behind this single sheet of paper sits an industrial operation that, by the time the war ends, will have produced somewhere in the region of 500 million individual map sheets, covering terrain from the fjords of Norway to the jungles of Burma. It is not a story that gets told with the same drama as the tanks or the bombers, but without it, the tanks and bombers would have had nowhere to go. This is the story of how American military cartography became one of the most decisive and least celebrated weapons of the Second World War, and how it left its German counterpart looking, by comparison, dangerously amateurish. To understand why this mattered, you first have to understand how poorly prepared the United States Army was for the job at the war's outset. In 1940, American military mapping was a modest affair, scattered across small engineer units with limited equipment and even less institutional memory. The country simply had not fought a war that demanded detailed foreign topographic intelligence on this scale before. Existing stocks of maps for Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific were often decades old, sourced from tourist guides, outdated colonial surveys, or whatever scraps could be gathered from Allied archives. There is a persisting story, repeated by men who served under him, that General George S. Patton once plotted early Third Army movements using little more than a Michelin road map, his own memory of the terrain, and an instinct for where armor could and could not cross ground that had defeated invading forces for 1,000 years. That anecdote is amusing in hindsight, but it points to something genuinely alarming. An army preparing to fight across 3 continents did not have reliable current maps of where it was going to fight. The scale of the problem only grew as the war did. Amphibious landings needed information no peacetime survey had ever bothered to collect. Things like the composition of a beach's sand, the location of underwater obstacles, the gradient of dunes behind the tide line, and the load-bearing capacity of the ground beyond. Airborne operations needed maps precise enough that a pathfinder could identify a single field in the dark by its hedgerow pattern. Artillery needed elevation data accurate to a few meters because a barrage that fell short by even a small margin could kill the men it was meant to protect. And all of this needed to be produced not for one battlefield, but for dozens, simultaneously, in theaters as different as the Ardennes forest and the atolls of the Central Pacific, using photography, captured documents, and fragments of pre-war survey data that frequently disagreed with one another. Existing government agencies, largely designed for peacetime domestic mapping, simply did not have the capacity, the security clearance structure, or the printing throughput to cope. Something new had to be built, and built quickly, because divisions could not wait years for the paperwork to catch up with the fighting. That something was the Army Map Service, established in 1942 through the consolidation of several smaller Corps of Engineers units, including the Old Engineer Reproduction Plant and its library and cartographic sections. Headquartered in Washington, with major production and training facilities at Fort Belvoir in Virginia, the AMS grew from a modest staff into an operation employing thousands of geographers, surveyors, draftsmen, photo interpreters, and printers working around the clock. Their task, on paper, sounded almost bureaucratic: to collect, catalog, compile, and reproduce topographic maps and related intelligence products for the armed forces. In practice, it meant building, from often fragmentary and contradictory sources, an entirely new picture of the world's terrain, accurate enough to bet men's lives on. The technical innovation that made this possible was the marriage of aerial photography with a device called the multiplex stereo plotter. Reconnaissance aircraft, flying in carefully overlapping passes, photographed the same stretch of ground from two slightly different positions, exactly as your two eyes see a room from two slightly different angles. When those overlapping photographs were loaded into projectors and viewed through the multiplex system, the operator saw not a flat picture, but a three-dimensional model of the landscape below: hills rising, valleys sinking, individual buildings standing proud of the ground. A trained technician could then trace contour lines directly from that stereoscopic image, essentially sculpting an accurate topographic map from two photographs taken from thousands of feet in the air. It was, in effect, an early form of what would today be recognized as photogrammetry, achieved with optics, mirrors, and a great deal of patient handiwork rather than computers. For coastal work, aircraft flew what was called zero-elevation photography, skimming as close to the wave tops as safety allowed to capture the exact profile of a beach as an assault craft's coxswain would actually see it, rather than the abstracted view from altitude. These images were stitched into long horizontal strips, annotated with known obstacles, gun positions, and terrain hazards, then folded into the operational maps issued to the men who would storm ashore. None of this happened in one location. Compilation and training were centered on Fort Belvoir and Washington, but printing plants operated in the field close to the theaters they served: in Britain in the run-up to Normandy, in North Africa during the Tunisian campaign, and across a rapidly expanding network in the Pacific, as island hopping demanded fresh charts for terrain that had often never been properly surveyed by anyone. The North African campaign alone required roughly 1,000 distinct map sheets, printed in a total of around 10 million copies, an extraordinary output for a campaign fought over largely unfamiliar desert terrain with limited existing survey data. Normandy dwarfed even that. Planners eventually called for something in the order of 3,000 separate map sheets, printed in a total approaching 70 million copies, covering everything from strategic overviews for corps commanders down to street-level city plans for the towns beyond the beaches. Where existing survey data was thin, the AMS and its British counterparts turned to unconventional sources, soliciting old holiday postcards, family photographs, and pre-war tourist guides from the public, anything that might reveal what a particular stretch of French coastline actually looked like at ground level. Soil samples brought back by beach reconnaissance parties, some collected under cover of darkness by men paddling ashore in canoes, were analyzed to confirm whether the sand at Omaha and Utah beaches could bear the weight of armored vehicles without bogging them down. Security around these products was treated with a seriousness that matched their importance. The most sensitive Normandy invasion maps carried a classification above top secret, marked with the code word bigot, a designation so restrictive that officers who held it were forbidden from flying over enemy territory for fear of capture and interrogation. Access lists were kept deliberately short. A soldier might be handed a detailed beach map only hours before boarding his landing craft, precisely so that if he were captured in a training accident or chance skirmish weeks earlier, he could not hand the invasion plan to the enemy simply by being taken prisoner. Printing plants operating in England worked under blackout conditions and armed guard, their output tracked sheet by sheet, because a single missing map in the wrong hands could, in theory, have told a German intelligence officer more about Allied intentions than any spy network. This obsessive secrecy sat oddly alongside the almost folksy way some of the underlying source material had been gathered: family holiday snapshots and tourist postcards feeding into documents guarded as closely as any weapon design. But it captures something true about the entire enterprise. Information about the ground itself had become, by 1944, as valuable and as dangerous as any piece of hardware in the Allied arsenal. The people using these products rarely saw the machinery behind them, only the finished sheet in a map case. A glider pilot navigating into Normandy in the dark relied on a map compiled from photographs that had, weeks earlier, been an abstract stereoscopic illusion on a technician's desk in England. An engineer clearing beach obstacles under fire referred to annotations sourced from a captured German survey document cross-checked against a resistance courier's sketch. Army units advancing through the hedgerow country of the bocage, terrain notoriously ill-suited to armor and badly mapped by pre-war standards, depended on updated sheets rushed forward from mobile printing units almost as fast as the front line moved. Records of exactly how individual maps performed in combat are patchy, understandably, because soldiers under fire were not filing detailed feedback on cartographic accuracy, but the broader pattern is clear enough from operational histories. Planning staffs across every American theater relied on AMS products as their baseline picture of the ground, and commanders adjusted their expectations of terrain, cover, and mobility accordingly. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Set this achievement against what the Wehrmacht was working with, and the contrast becomes genuinely striking. German military cartography was neither incompetent nor lazy. German survey units, organized under their own war maps and survey department, produced enormous quantities of material, including a lavishly bound 2-foot square commemorative atlas documenting the opening months of the invasion of the Soviet Union. But quantity and prestige are not the same as accuracy, and the Eastern Campaign exposed the limits of German preparation brutally. Vast stretches of the Soviet Union had never been properly surveyed to German standards, forcing planners to rely on outdated Tsarist-era mapping, captured Soviet material of uncertain reliability, and, in places, simple guesswork stitched together from whatever fragments of intelligence could be gathered. Roads marked as usable turned out to be dirt tracks that dissolved into mud with the autumn rains. Distances and terrain features that looked manageable on paper proved to be significant obstacles on the ground. The German military machine that prided itself on planning and precision was, in its eastern operations, frequently navigating with tools not dramatically better than the improvised road maps Patton reportedly used, only across a landscape many times larger and less forgiving. The American approach differed in both philosophy and infrastructure. Where German mapping was hampered by the sheer scale of unsurveyed Soviet territory and by an intelligence culture that, particularly under Hitler's direct interference, was prone to distorting field reports to match desired conclusions, the American system was built around continuous correction from fresh photographic evidence and a deliberately decentralized production network that could push updated sheets to the front lines within days rather than months. British cartographic intelligence, working through the War Office's geographical section and the Inter-Service Topographical Department, provided a crucial parallel effort and close collaboration, particularly on the immense task of mapping the Normandy coastline, and it would be inaccurate to present the American achievement as entirely solitary. But it was the sheer scale of American production capacity, feeding off vast quantities of aerial film and a workforce of thousands of trained specialists, that allowed the Allies to maintain a consistent stream of current, accurate mapping across simultaneous theaters in a way no single-axis power ever matched. When German coastal commanders in northern France still doubted, right up until the morning of the 6th of June, whether Normandy or the Pas de Calais was the genuine invasion target, they were relying in part on their own uncertain intelligence picture. The Allied planning staffs across the Channel, by contrast, were working from beach gradient charts precise enough to specify which stretches of sand could take a tank and which could not. The story did not end in Europe, and it is worth pausing on the Pacific theater because the challenge there was, in some ways, harder still. European mapping, however imperfect, could at least build on centuries of prior survey work by colonial powers and National Geographic institutes. Vast stretches of the Pacific had never been mapped to any useful military standard at all. Coral atolls barely large enough to appear on a standard chart had to be surveyed almost from scratch. Their lagoon depths, reef structures, and narrow landing beaches captured through low-level photographic runs flown at considerable risk from anti-aircraft fire. Marines preparing to assault islands like Tarawa and Peleliu depended on maps built from whatever combination of pre-war Japanese mandate survey fragments, submarine periscope photography, and aerial reconnaissance could be gathered in the weeks before an operation, often an uncomfortably thin foundation for planning an amphibious assault against fortified positions. Where the intelligence picture was incomplete, and it frequently was, the human cost could be severe. A reminder that even the most sophisticated mapping system in the world remained only as good as the source material feeding it, and that gaps in coverage translated directly into casualties on unfamiliar reef lines and unexpected coral shelves. The material legacy of this effort is easy to overlook precisely because it worked so well. Unlike a tank or an aircraft, a map does not announce its success through visible destruction. It succeeds by quietly ensuring that men land where they are meant to, that artillery falls where it is meant to, that supply columns find roads that actually exist. Assessing the AMS's precise contribution to any single battle is difficult, because good mapping is a background condition for success rather than a headline cause of it, and honest historians are cautious about attributing victories directly to cartography rather than to the men who fought using it. What can be said with confidence is that the sheer volume and currency of American mapping removed one enormous source of friction that had crippled military campaigns throughout history: the simple problem of commanders not actually knowing what the ground in front of them looked like. The techniques pioneered under wartime pressure, particularly the marriage of stereoscopic aerial photography with rapid field printing, did not disappear with peace. They evolved directly into the post-war Army Map Service's continuing work, through successor organizations, into the satellite-era geodesy, and eventually the digital mapping systems that underpin modern military and civilian navigation alike. Surviving examples of these wartime sheets, heavily annotated, sometimes stained and torn from use in the field, are held today in the cartographic collections of the National Archives and the Library of Congress, alongside captured German material that offers a direct, sobering comparison for anyone who cares to look. It is worth being honest, too, about where this comparison should not be pushed too far. German military cartographers were not incompetent, and it would be a distortion to suggest otherwise. Survey units, such as those attached to individual Army Corps, produced genuinely skilled work when time and resources allowed, and in static, well-surveyed regions of Western Europe, German maps of their own occupied territory could be perfectly serviceable. The failure was less a failure of cartographic craft than one of institutional pressure and geography. An intelligence culture that punished officers for delivering unwelcome assessments, combined with the sheer scale of unsurveyed Soviet territory and a chronic shortage of aerial reconnaissance resources as the war dragged on and Allied air superiority grew, meant that German mapping simply could not keep pace with the demands placed on it. The Americans, by contrast, entered the war with almost nothing, and built, in a matter of 2 or 3 years, a production apparatus specifically designed to solve this exact problem at industrial scale, backed by resources, aircraft, and film stock the Wehrmacht increasingly could not match as the war turned against it. It is that structural advantage, as much as any single technical innovation, that explains the gap between the two efforts by 1944. Return, for a moment, to that requisitioned house near Portsmouth, to the officers bent over their vast table in the small hours before the invasion. What they were studying was not a triumph of weaponry in any conventional sense. There was no explosive charge in that folded paper, no engine, no armor plate, and yet it represented something arguably rarer and more valuable in 1944 than any of those things: certainty in a war defined by fog, confusion, and catastrophic miscalculation. Certainty about where the sand would hold a tank's weight and where it would swallow one whole. Certainty about which hedgerow concealed a machine gun nest and which merely marked a farmer's boundary. That certainty had been purchased through years of patient, unglamorous labor by geographers, photo interpreters, and printers whose names appear in almost no history books, working in requisitioned buildings on both sides of the Atlantic, converting stereoscopic illusions into contour lines, and contour lines into the confidence a young soldier needed to step off a landing craft into darkness. Compare that to the German war planners staring at an atlas built from Tsarist surveys and captured fragments, still arguing among themselves in June 1944 about where the real blow would fall. One side had built a machine for turning uncertainty into paper. The other was still improvising with the maps it happened to have. 500 million sheets of paper did not win the war on their own, and no honest account would claim they did. But they made victory legible, sheet by sheet, beach by beach, hedgerow by hedgerow, in a way the Wehrmacht's own cartographers, for all their effort, never quite managed to match. The tanks got the glory. The maps got them there.